Welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a great weekend. We are sort of hitting this home stretch here for this second section of the material. We've gone through a lot of different areas of research. We've talked about memory and cognitive psychology. We looked at problem solving and other things related to memory. We also spent a lot of time talking about developmental psychology and intelligence. In essence, we are at the very last section that we're going to be covering here before the second exam, but it is a big one, much like developmental psychology was, where there were a lot of different places people can go when they get into this specific branch of psychology. The branch of psychology that we're going to be covering today is something called social psychology. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with this branch of psychology, know that anybody who calls themselves a social psychologist tends to focus their research attention on how the environment or social world is having some type of impact on us or potentially also groups. But when we talk about the social world, I mean a lot of different things, not only certain things that we do within labs, but certain things that happen in societies or groups. And sometimes just imagined things can be stuff that social psychologists are studying when we look at how our own internal mind and world tends to impact us in different ways. And when we look at the things that are impacted, it goes in a bunch of different directions. It's why this is probably one of the biggest areas of interest in psychology today. Granted, there are more people who call themselves clinical psychologists than social psychologists, but if you look at the scope of this specific branch of psychology, much like developmental psychology, since it can go in so many different directions, there's so many different applications to what people are studying in this branch of psychology, many people you'll find call themselves social psychologists. In fact, here at Berkeley, we have a ton of social psychologists studying a wide array of different topics that lead into other areas like cognitive psychology, personality psychology, clinical psychology, you name it. You'll find connections between what it is we're going to be covering in this class, what you'll cover if you ever take a future social psychology class, and many other branches of psychology that are out there. And this brings us to kind of a challenging point when we talk about social psychology. How do you, in an intro class, cover social psychology? When we could do it like a lot of the other areas that we've gone into, where we kind of give a broad overview of how people do research within the field and what topics are out there. But again, there are so many different topics and there's so many different ways that people can explore things that trying to provide a synopsis of what social psychologists do seems not only challenging, but kind of, I guess, narrow in our explanation of what social psychology is. So what the book decided to do, and what you'll find in many intro classes, we decided to do, is instead of trying to cover the whole broad spectrum of social psychology, we tend to focus in on specific topics, very popular ones that have been studied extensively for multiple decades, just to give people a better sense of not only what social psychology is about, but some of the big application-based concepts that social psychologists have explored, and then how our thinking, our conversation has progressed within those areas to what we currently can look at today in social psychology when trying to study these topics that have been around for sometimes about a century at this point. And we're going to do that in today's class by studying the topic of social perception, getting first a history of what early social perception psychologists were studying, then transitioning to kind of new ideas that started to pop up, new wrinkles in the conversation, so we can sort of get a sense of what current social psychologists studying different social perception topics are uniquely interested in, even if we can't necessarily focus in on all the specific things that people have applied this research to. Of course, when we get into talking about social perception, we should first talk about what it is that people are looking at when they decide to study this very broad topic within social psychology. So when we're talking about social perception in general, we're talking about how our understanding of people and situations comes about through the things that we're encountering in the environment. And that idea of social perception can be addressed, or I guess looked at from a number of different angles. People can ask lots of questions about this process of making sense of our world by the things that we're encountering. And over the years, people have asked some very poignant questions relating to this topic of social perception. One of the first questions that people asked, which was really interesting, was when we make sense of the world around us. This question of, are we analytical for a long time, or are we jumping to conclusions, was a really interesting point of conversation for about a decade or so when talking about how we understand the world around us. Then we started asking questions like, we apply some of the rules we understand with social perception to. Are we just making sense of situations in specific ways, individuals, groups of people, ourselves, people we're close to? What is it that's kind of the force behind a lot of the different tools we use to understand the world around us? And then can we change these things? Do we have a sense of how this process works so we could use it for a multitude of different purposes? We're going to try to address some of these questions when we get an overview of what social perception research is all about. And we're going to start with that first question. When do we make sense of the situation? When do we judge a person or a group when we encounter them and see them doing something? This question has been addressed from a number of different angles over the years, but what we consistently find time and time again, regardless of which individuals we're talking about, people, groups, large cultures, whatever, is that many individuals tend to engage in one specific effect when trying to make sense of the world. And it actually ties back to something we covered in the memory section. If you remember back in the memory section, we talked about something called the primacy effect. We said it was a part of the serial position or serial order effect, in that we do seem to have a tendency to remember things that we encounter at the beginning of lists and stories and other things much better than stuff that we are encountering in the middle or even near the end, if we're talking about long-term effects. Well, this primacy effect sort of works when we talk about social perception as well. It just works in a slightly different form. It's not necessarily, when we're talking about the primacy effect, about what we remember the most, even though that probably does play a role in this primacy effect that we see in social psychology. Instead, in social psych, when we talk about the primacy effect, at least in social perception, we talk about the fact that our first encounters seem to have more weight than all the other encounters that we have when we think about a certain situation or a certain person that we're meeting. It means that your first day of class, your first encounter with your roommate, all of those things have significantly more weight than any other encounters that you have. It doesn't mean that you judge somebody instantly when you see them and you can't possibly change your mind. It just means that it's going to take a lot of extra information for most people to change their mind about certain things once they've encountered them the first time. And lots of people sort of have an intuitive sense of how this process works. One of my favorite examples of this is something that you might have yourself encountered when you were growing up. I'm going to guess that many of you on the first day of school had parents dress you up in very nice outfits, told you to be on your very best behavior, made sure that you'd eaten your meals and gotten lots of sleep, because they have this intuitive sense that really impressing your teacher, maybe your principal and other people that you were going to encounter on that first day, would be in your best interest. I'm guessing most of your parents were not social psychologists and didn't necessarily even have the ability to cite information about the primacy effect. But you might want to thank your parents the next time you see them if they forced you to do this, because there is a lot of research that actually supports that kids that were forced to do those things tend to actually move on to be more successful within their classes. It tends to get the teacher's attention right off the bat, shape the way they interpret you, and theoretically have a lasting impact that can be tied to another thing that social psychologists often cite when talking about this primacy effect. This concept of something called self-fulfilling prophecies. Self-fulfilling prophecies are not necessarily why the primacy effect occurs, but definitely strengthen the impact of this primacy effect. These, we talk about how our behaviors, once we've made snap judgments about people or groups or even situations, can sort of evoke specific things out of those things we've judged. In general, if you think a friend of yours is funny after a first encounter, self-fulfilling prophecy suggests that you're going to do lots of things towards that friend to sort of evoke behavior related to some type of humor characteristic within them. Maybe make more eye contact, smile, laugh at their kind of ambiguous statements that you aren't quite sure if they're funny or not, because you have this expectation of them that, well, it kind of deserves in your mind those specific behaviors. If you flip the script and look at the person who's getting that treatment, well, if somebody's paying extra attention to you, always smiling about you, always laughing at everything you say, you're probably going to feel more compelled to, well, try to be funny, to try to have good conversations, to be less stressed and worried when you're talking to those individuals. And in essence, over time, those expectations that are being placed on a person, or you in this case, can start to bring out behaviors in you that maybe you wouldn't manifest in other different situations. One of my favorite studies to really highlight how powerful this effect was one done way back in 1977 by a trio of researchers named Snyder, Tank, and Berscheid. In this study, they invited male and female college students to come and participate in what they called a phone conversation study. And indeed, within this study, there were male and female participants having a lengthy phone conversation. They told the participants in this study that they were really just interested in how people had a back and forth, males and females had a back and forth dialogue with people they'd never actually met before. So they told them they were going to have a lengthy conversation with it being recorded so they could sort of just get the dynamics of the conversation that people have. And what they didn't tell the participants was that there was kind of an embedded wrinkle within it that was really the point of the study. So for the female participants, after they were given the instructions, they were brought into their own private rooms, each female that participated in the study. They were told to sit in front of a phone, and in a minute or two, they were going to get a call from whoever random male participant they were paired up with. The male participants, pretty much the same thing happened. They were brought into their own private rooms. They were given a number that they were supposed to call to have the phone conversation. So they had to get a couple of things set up before they should do that. And right before the experiment started, they added one last thing, which really was the point of the study. They told the male participants that this was the second or third iteration of the study, I can't remember which, and that the initial studies that they'd run for this particular experiment had some issues. In essence, there was sort of some discomfort in the conversation, things didn't work smoothly. They came to the conclusion that the biggest problem with the study was that the males just didn't seem to feel comfortable talking to somebody that they'd never seen. So they suggested to the males that they were going to go over into the room of the person that they were going to participate with. They were going to take a Polaroid picture of these females that they were going to talk with, and they were going to bring this picture back so the males could at least have a visual of who they were going to talk to. Now, they stressed to all the male participants that they weren't allowed to tell the females that they saw a picture of them, and they weren't supposed to say anything about it in the recording since it wasn't supposed to be a part of the study. Of course, it was actually the whole point of the study, but they were really pushed not to divulge that information that they'd seen a picture of who they were going to talk to. Unbeknownst to them, the picture that they received had nothing to do with the person that they were going to talk to. Just a random photograph that they were given of one of two women. One woman that they were given a photograph of was very attractive on numerous scales. I know this is tough to really stomach sometimes, but in our attraction and relationships lecture that we have, or section that we're going to have this week, you'll see how social psychologists over the years have tried to devise ways to kind of calculate and guesstimate who's going to be rated as fairly attractive by most individuals across a wide range of different cultures. What these researchers did in this 1977 study was to find a face of a female that kind of matched those requirements. Males were not shown this picture. They were instead shown a picture of a female that was rated as extremely unattractive. Again, this is based on attraction research and certain features and certain things that you look for within faces to kind of get a sense of who's going to be seen attractive and who isn't, even of course, though, of course, there's going to be some individual differences that you can't control for. Just to sum up, these males were told they were going to have a conversation with a female. They were given a picture and led to believe that that picture was actually of the person they were going to talk to. In reality, they were just given one of two pictures, either a picture of an attractive female or an unattractive female. In this study, the males behaved sort of the way they expected them to behave. The males that were paired up with the attractive photo were much nicer to the female that they were talking with. They made lots of overtures about possibly getting together at some point in the future. They did all the things that you would probably expect a person to do when they were interested in the other individual and found that person physically attractive. Now, mind you, they didn't say that they found the other person attractive because that wasn't what they were supposed to do, but they did lots of stuff to suggest interest. Where the males paired up with the unattractive photo sort of did the opposite. They were much more aloof. They certainly weren't engaging in very intimate conversations. And they sort of just try to watch the time pass. This wasn't a universal thing for every single participant in the study, but there was a pretty robust difference between the two different pairings that males encountered. And they didn't know that necessarily that's why they were doing what they were doing, but there was a pretty easy to identify difference in the treatment of the females based on the groups that they happened to randomly be paired up with. But that wasn't necessarily the point of the study. What they really wanted to see after these conversations happened wasn't whether or not the males would treat the females differently, but whether or not the females' reaction to these treatments could actually be identified by people who had no idea what the experiment was about. So when this conversation ended, they actually took the recordings, which they did make of the conversations, deleted the male sides of the conversation. So you just had a female talking to some random person that was never really identified. And they brought these recordings, each individual, to a person who had no idea, or to a bunch of people actually, who had no idea what the experiment was about. And they asked them to do something kind of weird. They said, we know you don't know what these females in these conversations look like, but what we'd like you to do is just guess, based off how they're reacting, how they're behaving in this conversation, how attractive you think these females, each individual female, is in these conversations. And what they found was that for each female who happened to randomly be placed with an attractive photo, their ratings of attraction by these independent raters who had no idea what the experiment was about were usually much higher than the females paired up with the unattractive photo. It was a pretty darn robust effect if you look at the data. And what that highlights is how unbelievably powerful this self-fulfilling prophecy is. Right? It's not just about somebody treating somebody in a specific way where the story ends. Being treated in a specific way evokes specific behaviors that even with independent individuals observing you can be identified and kind of reflect whatever expectations were being placed on you. It means that we really want you to the next time you actually place an expectation on a classmate, a teacher, or a situation, to think about how that's impacting your behaviors. If you're sitting in your chemistry class one week, trying to avoid eye contact with the teacher, doing all these things, making them feel like they're very boring, just understand that that treatment of them could be the thing that's making them significantly more boring. If you find a way to be more engaged, to make more eye contact, be amazed as to how interesting your chemistry teacher might actually be at some point in time. And same thing with people who you like. You could always just take a step back and ask, are they doing things I like because of what I'm coaxing out of them, or is it something that's about them? Self-fulfilling prophecy idea goes a whole bunch of different directions. And it also gets tied not only to individuals, but to groups. We start to place expectations on certain people just because they're part of groups. And those expectations we place on them gets us to treat them in a specific way, which gets them to start to follow in certain context, at least with us being kind. What can that do to these individuals? This was one of the major questions that started to be asked as we sort of expanded our scope in social perceptual research to not just individuals, but groups as a whole. And it led to a bevy of research on something that's still explored extensively today, and the topic of what we call stereotypes. You'll oftentimes nowadays see it described as stigma and prejudice, something that we actually offer a class on here at Berkeley. One of our distinguished faculty members that's been here for quite some time now often teaches it about once a year. And it sort of builds off of early research on this topic of social perception of groups. Now, if we go back to the early years of social perception research in groups, I want us to note that the kind of early definitions of how we judge groups, how we make sense of things, and also why we're doing this was a little bit less, I guess, not necessarily polarized, but I guess intense than it is now. Historically, when social psychologists studied the topic of stereotypes, they were talking about stereotypes as sort of a type of schema that we have in our head for lots of groups of individuals. Researchers said, especially in the early years, that stereotyping groups was sort of a necessary thing. We want to be able to navigate in the world around us. We need to be able to clump people together into groups so we can quickly understand things and predict how certain things are going to play out. And there is a lot of researchers still to this day that say when we stereotype people in these smaller groups and in accurate ways, it might help us. Say, for example, if you come up with a stereotype that all people that work in janitorial services tend to be pretty handy, tend to know where lots of things are, and tend to, if you find yourself lost, be able to access things for you. Well, if you're locked out of your office one night and you run into a janitorial person who happens to have keys to get you in, and you just happen to operate on that stereotype that they're very helpful and they're knowledgeable about that, well, then acting on that stereotype might be helpful. But historically, even though we've focused on stereotypes fitting in lots of different categories and helping us, there's still this recognition that stereotypes can take a bad turn very quickly. When generalizations start to become inaccurate, almost too wide-reaching, and start to focus on negative things that we tie with specific groups, well, that's when we start getting into really challenging and uncomfortable stereotype research that's been going on for almost a century now. And oftentimes when we talk about those things, we tie in two other terms that are sort of intertwined with this concept of stereotypes, what we call prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice, by definition, is when attitudes follow specific stereotypes that we have. And technically, we could have positive and neutral prejudice. Well, I guess neutral doesn't quite make sense, but positive prejudices about people being in specific groups. But historically, research, even in the early years when we started studying this, tended to focus on the negative prejudices that came along with our stereotypes we hold about members in specific groups. And when these prejudices are coming from inaccurate stereotypes, and just are completely unjustified based on the stereotypes we have, this is when we can start to have lots of problems, especially when these prejudices are paired up with discrimination. We're not just feeling a certain way about a member of a group, but treating members of specific groups in very specific ways based on the stereotypes we have. And technically, if you look at the history of research on stereotypes, we can discriminate based on positive assumptions that we have about members of specific groups. But most of the research over the years is focused on the negative discrimination that we display that's based on negative stereotypes. And when we start looking at big picture things that people can be discriminatory on, I'm guessing a lot of specific ideas come to mind. We can talk about discrimination based on gender and race and age, and religion, and a whole bunch of other things that social psychologists indeed have studied over the years. One thing that's interesting to note is that as we continue to analyze this research on stereotypes and how they're formed and where prejudice and discrimination comes from, we started to change the conversation about these things sort of being necessary in helping us understand the world and, well, having potential consequences to them, but there being a debate as to whether or not we should do away with stereotypes, to researchers saying, no, these things seem to be stuff that gets ingrained within us through social learning, through experiences, and it doesn't have to rely on these big things like age and gender and race that we tend to intuitively tie to this. One of the first people to really highlight how easily these types of things can be learned and how impactful they can be, even if we don't necessarily think of certain things as important, was actually a teacher. She was a teacher at the time when she came up with a really interesting activity / experiment about a century ago now in a very small town called Riceville, Iowa. What this teacher did, her name was Jane Elliott, was she instructed her children to kind of, I guess, starts to believe that the color of a child's eyes was indicative of their potential for learning and their ability overall. She, in the first iteration of this study, which if I recall correctly, happened just shortly after the assassination of Martin Luther King, suggested to her students on the first day that those who had blue eyes were actually superior to those in the class that had brown eyes. She then, for the day, continued to kind of, I guess, circulate these assumptions and give students opportunities to either thrive or struggle. And then she showed that those who had suddenly been told they weren't as superior as others manifested a lot of the expectations that she had placed on them. And those that were told they were superior not only performed pretty well on that day, but really tormented their classmates. The second day, she actually reversed the script, telling the brown-eyed students that she'd actually made a mistake on the first day, probably because she was a blue-eyed person and often makes mistakes. It's actually brown-eyed people that were superior to blue eyes. She told blue eyes this same exact thing, and essentially the kids reversed script as well. The brown-eyed students started to perform extremely well in the classroom on that day, and those that had just excelled the day before because they thought they were part of a superior group suddenly struggled mightily in all the different activities that were going on. So we're being tormented, so we're suddenly the tormentors the next day. In this work that Elliott did year after year after year, she really highlighted how important social learning is to the formation of these stereotypes, how quickly we can grasp onto certain things, and how impactful these assumptions can be on us. What I really like about Elliott's work was that it spun off in a bunch of different directions as it progressed. She showed later on that it wasn't just kids who had teachers suggesting these things who could pick up on these stereotypes. She showed that adults could learn these things just as well and just as quickly. She also showed that there are ways to help people overcome these things. And going through experiences where you do encounter this can help to an extent inoculate you from some of the kind of more susceptible things that I guess being more susceptible to things like this in the future. Elliott's work is still to this day cited in pretty much every intro class around. And historically, just to really highlight what she did, because I find it extremely interesting and groundbreaking, I typically show a video in class that highlights one of the kind of, I think, third iterations of the experiment. It was actually the iteration that was filmed for a video called The Eye of the Storm. The video we typically watched is actually a follow-up to that called The Class Divided. Problem with the video is that the kids in that video say some really harmful things. They use a number of slurs. They say lots of things that can be very uncomfortable. So I kind of decided last year to sort of scratch that from the docket. But if any of you really want to see that video, just to get a sense of Jane Elliott's work, the original video was called The Eye of the Storm. You can find it online if you look for it. The other one that's out there is something called The Class Divided, and that one's even easier to access. A follow-up that looks at not only Eliot's original study, but kind of how her work got spun off in a number of directions after her initial research. For today, hopefully this synopsis of what she did can highlight, one, how we sort of built off of our original stereotype research, and two, how we started to ask very poignant questions when it came to these processes that led us in a lot of sometimes uncomfortable but important directions that we've gone through over the years. Another topic that very closely relates to this that we do definitely want to cover in an intro class kind of revolves around this notion of, when we're jumping to these conclusions, how we're doing it. You know, when we see somebody doing something in a specific situation, technically, we can make sense of that in a variety of different ways. And the process of making sense of it is something eventually social psychologists called attributions. It's kind of trying to make sense or assign cause to something that we're encountering in the world. And when we're judging something that we see, we can usually judge something that we're seeing in two ways. We can assume that what we're seeing is a byproduct of the actor, the person that we're watching engage in some specific behavior, or we can assume that the situation that we're encountering is really just a byproduct of what happened in the environment. It's not necessarily telling us anything about the person themselves that we're seeing act. This is the difference between what we call internal and external attributions. So say, for example, you see a classmate get an F on a test, as you see in this picture. We could assume that that person got an F because of some skill set they have or a lack of motivation that they have within the classroom. Or we could assume that that F was because maybe they had a bad breakup the day before. They didn't have enough time to study, or the questions on the test just were asking things that they happened to not have studied. There's lots of different ways we can go when we're trying to understand what it is we're seeing in the social world. For a long period of time, much like we talked about with the primacy effect, people just kind of debated, argued about which type of attributions were best, how we could go about making accurate ones, and, well, when these things happen. Then we sort of stumbled upon something in the 1960s that blew this whole conversation out of the water. That was the fact that when we see people judging others, making sense of situations, even though there's a lot of logical ways for us to come to better conclusions, most of us forego those processes. And instead, we engage in something that for a long period of time was called the fundamental attribution error. Nowadays, it's sometimes listed as the correspondence bias. We'll sort of explain why that's the case a little bit later. But just know that this fundamental attribution error, this process that we go through, suggests that when we see somebody acting, we tend not to think about all the situational factors that we should consider. We tend not to ask multiple questions about what it is we're looking at. And instead, we just jump to the conclusion that whatever we saw is probably a byproduct of something related to the actor. Or in essence, we almost always make internal attributions of the behaviors of others that we're seeing. And when we discovered this specific effect, the reason why we started calling it the fundamental attribution error is because researchers realized pretty quickly through multiple different studies that almost everybody being presented with information was doing this. And in fact, later studies in the 1960s didn't explore whether or not we did this, but just explored how far we go sometimes with our tendency to commit this fundamental attribution error. One of my favorite studies to highlight the extent people went to when engaging in this fundamental attribution error was a study done by two researchers named Jones and Harris. In this study, they brought people in and essentially forced them to write essays that were either in favor of a very polarizing person in the time, a gentleman named Fidel Castro, or they had to write essays that were strongly opposed, or at least suggesting they were strongly opposed to Fidel Castro and a lot of things that were going on down in Cuba. They were told when they arrived that they had no option as to whether or not they were going to write a pro or negative one. They were just going to be assigned to a group, and their requirement for them to be able to receive credit for participation in the study was to follow those instructions to the letter. So in essence, you had a bunch of people that were just forced to do something. They were all forced to do it together in front of each other. And then the researchers collected these essays that people wrote and surprisingly redistributed them to all the people participating. So now everybody in the study had an essay written not by themselves at this point, but some other person that was sitting right next to them as they were forced to write either a pro or anti-Castro essay. They were told once they received that other person's essay to read it and do something kind of odd. Guess, just based on what they were reading, how much this person really liked or disliked Fidel Castro. And what they found was that almost universally, people who read pro-Castro essays assumed that the person writing it must really love Fidel Castro. And people reading the anti-Castro essays almost universally assumed that the people who wrote those essays must really hate Fidel Castro. That might just seem silly on the surface, but if you dig deeper, that shows something pretty darn profound. Now, you can have a situation where you're literally forced to do something, yet you assume when you see somebody else who's done that exact same thing, that their actions are really a byproduct of what they're feeling and who they are. Again, this was just one of many studies to highlight how powerful this fundamental attribution error was, which is kind of why we started calling it fundamental. Now you might be asking, well, why did we change the name for it? And why did we start calling it the correspondence bias? Well, that name change, which kind of relates back to the original name that was given to it, is a result of something that we started discovering, or at least looking at much more closely in the 90s. And that's the fact that even though this is something that was considered universal to people in the United States, or what we call Western cultures, when we opened up the scope of who we were looking at, started looking at other cultures, what we found was this fundamental attribution error or correspondence bias doesn't often work in those cultures. One of the champions of research on this idea was somebody that actually worked here at Cal for a decade plus, a gentleman named Kai-Ping Pong. And just to highlight his work and some of the conclusions that he came to, we're going to watch a video here. In this video, hopefully, just give me 1 second. This video here hopefully will give you an idea of some of the work that Pong did and why it really changed our conversation on the topic of social perception. Hold on 1 second. Okay, here's the video.
Culture is all of these things and more, beyond rituals, dances, and dialects. It is the very scaffolding of our psyches, how we think, what we feel, how we relate to others, and who we think we are, all depend on the culture around us. Even how we interpret behavior can reveal how culture shapes us. What do you see happening in this aquarium? Is this fish a brave fish going along on her own? Or has she been kicked out of school for not following the rules? Kai-Ping Pong of the University of California at Berkeley and his colleague Michael Morris of Stanford University study how people from East Asia and North America interpret behaviors differently. They have developed a method which uses cartoons of fish to represent social interactions. In one study, American and East Asian subjects were asked why the fish moved as they did.
American subjects pay more attention to the individual fish, individual's movements, and individual's desires. And the Asian subjects pay more attention to the movement of the group fish.
Next, they were asked to pay attention to the blue fish on the right, then to describe the reasons for the blue fish's behavior.
And Americans always talk about individual fish wanting to get away from the group, tired of the group, hate the group, wanting to be the leaders of the group. Whereas Chinese and the Japanese students were more likely to say the individual fish couldn't get along with group fish. The group fish kick out the individual fish, and they just don't like this individual fish.
These cultural differences in how we interpret behavior can lead to starkly different versions of events. A fact that Dr. Pang learned by tragic coincidence.
One night, I got a phone call from a friend who said, turn on the TV.
A disgruntled graduate student walked into the Department of Physics with a .38 caliber revolver and shot.
And suddenly, I saw a familiar face on the screen. I knew the guy because he dated my wife's roommate in China.
Those shots killed rival student Linhua Shan.
I talked to my wife about this, and we thought that, well, if he married my wife's roommate, then he probably won't become such a mass murderer. And we thought that too bad they didn't get married.
Pang's American friends and the press responded quite differently to the crime, saying that Gung Lu was a time bomb and would have killed the woman along with himself. But the Chinese papers had another point of view.
Chinese media report was basically about how he had a terrible relationship with other people, how he couldn't adjust to the American cultures, and how easy to get a gun in the United States. Basically, if he were in China, he would not commit the crime.
That video I always find pretty interesting. The work of Kai-Ping Pong definitely was groundbreaking. In the 90s, it continued to be a very important thing, still is to some extent, a part of our daily conversations about how we look at certain social psychology topics differently if we start to include culture and our experiences into the conversation. I still to this day slightly disagree with his conclusions about that specific example as to whether or not that was really highlighting fundamental differences between culture. But regardless of what the impetus behind his research was, his later findings highlighting the differences in focus, highlighting the experiences we have in childhood, and how they shape our kind of penchant to interpret situations was amazing, and it really did get us to question this fundamental attribution error and where it was coming from and whether or not it was inherent. But it's also important to note that there were other things that we'd already discovered along the way that had brought into question how fundamental this fundamental attribution error was. One of the things that really kind of flew in the face of this fundamental attribution error was something we discovered shortly after kind of giving the name to that correspondence bias, was something called the actor-observer effect. It's the fact that even though we do tend to make internal attributions for others when we see them doing something, whether it's a good thing, a bad thing, or a neutral thing, we don't necessarily do the same thing for ourselves. In fact, more often than not, when we're judging our own behaviors, especially the negative and neutral ones, we tend to instead make external attributions. And one of the studies that sort of highlighted how this effect worked, and also how as we got closer and closer to ourselves, this actor-observer effect started to take over, was one that was done by the same researcher we talked about before, Jones, and another colleague, Nesbitt, where they had people come in and write down their names, write down the name of a family member, and also, I don't have it listed here, but wrote down the name of one of their best friends. And then after having people do that, they gave them all these hypothetical scenarios to explain. They said things like, you got caught cheating on a test. Your father got into a fight at a bar. Walter Cronkite learned to fly a plane. All of these things, some of them being negative, like the ones I mentioned at the beginning, some of them being neutral, like the last one I mentioned, and some of them being positive. Again, they asked people to explain what probably led up to these things. And what they found was this actor-observer effect coming through. The closer and closer people got to themselves, family members, good friends, started making more and more external attributions. When they got to themselves exactly, almost every attribution they made was external, save for one thing. And this brings us to another effect that this particular study and others started to highlight. It's something that we nowadays call the self-serving attribution bias or the self-serving bias. It's our tendency when we are judging our own behaviors to reserve the right to make internal attributions when we do relatively positive things. So if we get an F on a test, odds are pretty darn good. We're going to make an external attribution at that point and talk about bad questions, or not having enough time, or having some type of distraction that came up. But if we get an A on a test, well, the odds are pretty darn good. We're going to instead assume that that's a byproduct of us, our innate ability to do well, or just how smart we are as a person. Again, this happens in a lot of different situations. You don't have many accidents on your record, you'll probably assume it's an indication of how great you are as a driver. If you've got a number, well, it'll probably be more attributed to bad luck or just other drivers than anything else. This works for pretty much everybody, but much like the fundamental attribution or correspondence bias we talked about before, there's lots of exceptions to this that have gained a lot of interest over the years. One of the exceptions that we found is cultural in nature. In East Asian or collectivist societies, like we just saw in the last video and just discussed on the last slide, this actor-observer effect and self-serving attribution bias tends to get kind of turned on its head. So where people in those collectivist societies tend to blame a lot of the things that they're doing well on the situation and tend to blame a lot of their struggles instead on themselves. And when people in the United States discovered this flip, they started looking for other groups that might struggle with these kind of things, or not necessarily struggle, but might display this same flip, worrying that it could be tied to things like anxiety issues and depression and mental health problems. And we started kind of critiquing what this does to people within that culture. And it spurred on a lot of interesting application-based research. But it's also important to note that as we talk about this, people in collectivist societies, when they started recognizing the differences, were equally upset and worried, but not about necessarily people within their own culture, as much as people in our independent Western societies. They started to ask, what this means for motivation levels within our culture, what this means for what drives people to do what they need to do in order to succeed. And their sentiment was, if nothing you do wrong is your fault and any tiny thing you do right is because you're amazing, and what drives you to really try to accomplish anything in life when just small tiny wins can be all you need to constantly feel great about yourself. There's also been work that's gone into looking at how this develops across different ages and whether or not clinical issues or clinical challenges do present kind of an alternate effect when we're looking at individuals. And this type of stuff, I think, is a great place to kind of close out this conversation on social perception, because it allows us to see how one tiny thing can bring us in so many different directions. Not just in trying to explain how stuff works, but looking at how this applies in a multitude of different situations across a multitude of different individuals. And it's really important to note and highlight again that this works for all the topics we've looked at today, and it works for pretty much every topic within social psychology. There's nuances to every question we address today, when we judge others, how we make sense of these things, whether or not it works for individuals or groups, and if it doesn't work quite the same, what are the differences and how can we see these things in action? We're going to explore this same path of looking at the current, past, the terms, when we get into our next topic within social psychology on Wednesday. In particular, we're going to do it when we look at a very important topic called social influence. But for today, I see we're out of time. So thank you very much. Bid you adieu. Hope all of you are doing well. And well, so I hope to see you again soon. Take care, everybody.